The steppe does not announce its dangers. It does not build walls or raise banners. It does not warn of what moves across it. It simply stretches outward, vast, quiet, and indifferent, until distance itself becomes a weapon. In the early 13th century, that distance concealed a force unlike anything the Western world had yet encountered. By 1223, the Mongol Empire was no longer a rising power. It was an expanding certainty. Under the command of Genghis Khan, Mongol armies had already shattered kingdoms across Central Asia. Cities that had stood for centuries, fortified, wealthy, and confident, had been reduced to silence in a matter of weeks. The Mongols did not simply conquer. They dismantled resistance with a methodical precision that left little room for recovery. But what lay beyond the eastern horizons of Europe was still poorly understood. Rumors traveled faster than armies. Traders spoke of riders who never seemed to tire, of arrows that fell with unnatural accuracy, of commanders who anticipated movements before they happened. Entire regions vanished from trade routes, leaving only absence where once there had been connection. For the princes of the Kievan Rus, these stories were distant and uncertain. Their world was already fractured, divided into competing principalities, bound together loosely by shared heritage but strained by rivalry and mistrust. Kiev, once the center of power, had long since lost its dominance. Authority was dispersed among princes who guarded their autonomy carefully. To the south, the Cumans, nomadic steppe allies and occasional adversaries, were the first to feel the full weight of the Mongol advance. They had seen steppe warfare before. Raids, migrations, shifting alliances. This was not new, but what approached them in the early 1220s was different in both scale and discipline. The Mongol generals Jebe and Subutai did not behave like typical raiders. They did not linger. They did not overextend. They advanced with purpose, probing, testing, and withdrawing with calculated restraint. When the Cumans finally broke, it was not in a single battle, but through the slow realization that they were facing an enemy they could not outmaneuver. Their retreat carried them westward, into the lands of the Rus. The arrival of the Cumans was not merely a military development. It was a political crisis. They came not as raiders, but as refugees, bringing with them warnings that were difficult to interpret and even harder to believe. They spoke of an enemy that did not behave according to the known rules of war, of feigned retreats that turned into encirclements, of scouts who appeared days ahead of the main force, mapping terrain with unsettling precision, of an army that seemed smaller than it was, and stronger than it should be. The Cuman leaders sought alliance. For the Rus princes, the decision was not straightforward. The Cumans had been both allies and enemies in the past. Trust was conditional and often temporary. Yet the urgency of their request could not be ignored. If the Cumans had been defeated so thoroughly, what did that imply about the strength of the enemy pursuing them? A council was called. Princes from across the fractured Rus lands gathered to discuss the threat. Among them were Mstislav the Bold of Galicia, Mstislav of Kiev, and other regional leaders, each bringing their own ambitions, concerns, and calculations. There was no unified command structure, no single authority to impose a strategy. Decisions would have to emerge through negotiation, compromise, and persuasion. This, more than anything, would shape what followed. The Cumans urged immediate action. They argued that delay would only allow the Mongols to advance deeper into Rus territory, gaining knowledge of the land and its defenses. They emphasized the need for a united force, one that could meet the Mongols in open battle before they established a foothold. Some princes agreed. Others were more cautious. The Mongols, after all, were still distant. Their numbers were unclear, their intentions uncertain. There was a temptation to treat the threat as exaggerated, another steppe incursion that could be repelled through conventional means. But uncertainty is a way of narrowing options. In the end, the decision was made to assemble a coalition army. It would be large, larger than any single Mongol detachment could reasonably match. Based on the information available, the combined forces of the Rus princes, alongside their Cuman allies, would march eastward to confront the invaders. On paper, it was a formidable force. Tens of thousands of infantry and cavalry, drawn from multiple principalities, each contingent led by its own prince. The Cumans contributed their own mounted warriors, experienced in steppe combat, though shaken by recent defeat. Numbers, however, can obscure as much as they reveal. The coalition lacked cohesion. Each prince maintained authority over his own troops. Coordination would depend on cooperation rather than command. Communication across such a force would be slow and inconsistent, particularly in unfamiliar terrain. Meanwhile, far to the east, the Mongol commanders had already begun shaping the battlefield. Jebe and Subutai were not acting on impulse. Their campaign into the western steppe was part reconnaissance, part demonstration. They were mapping the edges of the known world, not just geographically, but strategically. They had no intention of engaging a numerically superior force on equal terms. Instead, they would rely on the same principles that had carried them across Asia: mobility, deception, and control of information. When the first Mongol envoys reached the Rus princes, their message was simple. They claimed no interest in Rus lands. Their conflict, they said, was with the Cumans alone. If the Rus withdrew their support, there would be no need for further confrontation. It was a calculated statement. The Mongols understood the fragile nature of the Rus coalition. They recognized the potential for distrust between allies. By presenting themselves as a limited threat, they aimed to weaken the resolve of their opponents before the first arrow was loosed. The response from the Rus was decisive and revealing. The envoys were executed. It was not merely a rejection of Mongol diplomacy. It was a signal of intent. The coalition had committed itself to confrontation, closing the door on negotiation entirely. For the Mongol commanders, this outcome was not unexpected. If anything, it simplified their task. With diplomacy removed from the equation, the campaign could proceed according to plan. The Mongols began to withdraw. At first, it appeared as though they were retreating in the face of a larger force. Scouts reported their movement eastward, away from the advancing Rus army. There were no signs of defensive stand, no effort to fortify positions. To the Rus princes, this seemed to confirm their assumptions. The enemy was avoiding battle. Perhaps the stories had been exaggerated. Perhaps the Mongols, formidable as they were, recognized the futility of facing a united force of such size. Encouraged by this interpretation, the coalition advanced. But movement across the steppe is rarely straightforward. Distances are deceptive. Water sources are unevenly distributed. Supply lines stretch thin quickly, particularly for a force not accustomed to sustained operations in open terrain. The Mongols, by contrast, were operating within their element. They controlled the pace of engagement. Their withdrawal was not a retreat in the conventional sense. It was a deliberate extension of the battlefield, drawing the Rus forces deeper into unfamiliar ground, away from a logistical base, and into a space where coordination would become increasingly difficult. Days turned into weeks. The Rus army continued its pursuit, maintaining the belief that they were pressing an advantage. Scouts reported glimpses of Mongol forces ahead. Small groups, always moving, never committing to battle. Each sighting reinforced the perception of an enemy in retreat. But with each mile, the cohesion of the coalition began to erode. Communication between contingents became strained. Differences in pace created gaps in the line of march. Some units pushed ahead aggressively, eager to engage. Others lagged behind, more cautious, more uncertain. The Cumans, familiar with steppe warfare, began to sense the pattern. This was not a rout. It was preparation. Yet their warnings carried limited weight. They were allies, but not equals in the coalition. Their recent defeat also undermined their credibility. To some Rus princes, their caution appeared as hesitation, or even fear. The advance continued, unaware that they were no longer pursuing an enemy, but entering a design. Somewhere ahead, beyond the visible horizon, the Mongol commanders were no longer withdrawing. They were waiting. The steppe offered no clear boundaries. There were no walls to anchor defense, no forests to obscure movement, no rivers wide enough, yet to force a decisive pause. What it offered instead was exposure. Every movement could be seen from a distance. Every mistake could unfold in full view, too far away to correct in time. By the time the Rus coalition reached the region of the Kalka River, the campaign had already begun to shift, though few within the army recognized it. The Mongols had stopped withdrawing, not abruptly, not in a way that would signal clear change. Their movement simply slowed, then stabilized. Scouts continued to appear, still elusive, still avoiding engagement. But now, they lingered just long enough to be seen. It was an invitation. For the Rus commanders, the signs were interpreted through expectation rather than experience. After weeks of pursuit, the idea of a decisive confrontation had taken hold. The Mongols, it seemed, had finally chosen to stand. What remained uncertain was where, and under what conditions. The Kalka River itself was not a major natural barrier. It cut through the steppe with shallow banks and variable depth, more an obstacle to movement than a line of defense. But its presence mattered. It created a point of reference in otherwise featureless terrain, a place where armies could orient themselves. For Subutai and Jebe, it was efficient. They did not need fortifications. They needed alignment, of timing, of terrain, of expectation. Their force, numbering perhaps 20,000, was not concentrated in a single mass. It was distributed, layered across distance in a way that obscured its true size and position. Advanced elements remained visible, maintaining contact with the Rus scouts. The main body stayed further back, positioned to respond as needed. This dispersion was not weakness. It was control. The Rus army, by contrast, had become increasingly fragmented. The initial unity of purpose, formed in council, had been stretched thin by the realities of movement across the steppe. Different princes advanced at different speeds. Mstislav the Bold of Galicia, aggressive and confident, pushed forward with a contingent and the Cuman allies. He had taken the lead in the pursuit and was unwilling to relinquish momentum. To him, hesitation risked losing the enemy entirely. Behind him, other princes followed, but not in tight formation. Mstislav of Kiev, commanding a substantial force, moved more deliberately. His caution reflected both temperament and responsibility. As one of the senior figures in the coalition, his concern extended beyond immediate engagement to the preservation of his army. Between these two poles, aggression and caution, the coalition stretched across miles of open ground. There was no unified command directing this movement in real time. Decisions were made locally, based on limited information, often without full awareness of the broader situation. This disjointed advance was precisely what the Mongols had anticipated. They did not need to break the Rus army in a single moment. They needed to separate it, segment by segment, until each part could be engaged under favorable conditions. The first contact came not as a formal battle, but as a clash of forward elements. Mstislav the Bold, leading the vanguard, encountered Mongol forces near the Kalka. The engagement was brief, fluid, and inconclusive. The Mongols skirmished, then withdrew, drawing the Rus forward once more. To Mstislav, this confirmed the pattern he believed he understood. The enemy was unwilling to stand. He ordered continued pursuit. The Cumans rode alongside, their mobility matching that of the Mongols, but their confidence had not returned. They recognized the rhythm of these movements, the careful spacing, the controlled withdrawal, the absence of panic. This was not retreat. It was staging. Still, momentum carried the vanguard forward. When the main Mongol force finally revealed itself, it did so on its own terms. There was no dramatic unveiling, no sudden appearance over a ridge. Instead, the scattered elements that had been observed over days began to cohere. Lines formed where there had been none. Movement synchronized. The battlefield, which had seemed open and undefined, began to take shape. The Mongols deployed with precision. Their formation was not rigid in the way of traditional infantry lines. It was elastic, capable of extending, contracting, and shifting direction with speed. Units operated with a level of coordination that allowed them to respond dynamically without waiting for centralized commands. At the center were disciplined mounted archers, capable of delivering sustained volleys while in motion. On the flanks, cavalry units positioned themselves for maneuver, ready to exploit openings or create them. Behind this visible line, reserves remained out of immediate sight, held back to reinforce or envelop as the situation demanded. The Rus vanguard, in contrast, was already committed. Mstislav the Bold had advanced far enough that withdrawal would not be simple. His forces, including the Cumans, were in contact with the Mongols before the rest of the coalition had fully arrived. There was no time to reorganize into a cohesive formation. The battle began in fragments. Arrows came first. Mongol horse archers moved within range, loosing volleys with practiced rhythm. Their mobility allowed them to maintain distance, striking without exposing themselves to close combat. The effect was not immediate destruction, but pressure, constant, disorienting, and difficult to counter. The Rus forces responded as they could. Their strength lay in heavy cavalry and infantry capable of close engagement. But to bring that strength to bear, they needed proximity. They needed the Mongols to stand and fight. The Mongols did not. Instead, they yielded ground selectively. When pressed, they withdrew just enough to maintain distance, continuing to fire as they moved. This created the impression of weakness, of a line giving way under pressure. For commanders accustomed to more static forms of battle, this behavior suggested opportunity. Mstislav pressed harder. The Cumans, caught between familiarity and urgency, followed. Their experience told them to be cautious. Their position within the coalition compelled them to advance. Behind them, other Rus contingents began to arrive, but not in coordinated sequence. Each prince brought his forces into the engagement as they reached the battlefield, often committing immediately rather than waiting for alignment with neighboring units. This piecemeal arrival prevented the formation of a unified front. Instead of a single, cohesive army, the Rus forces entered the battle as a series of overlapping segments, each fighting its own engagement, each responding to local conditions without full awareness of the larger structure. The Mongols exploited this immediately. Their feigned withdrawals became more pronounced. Units on the flanks appeared to break away under pressure, drawing segments of the Rus forces into pursuit. As these segments advanced, gaps opened between them. Into these gaps, Mongol cavalry moved, not in reckless charges, but in controlled arcs, circling, probing, isolating. They targeted communication lines, disrupted coordination, and prevented the Rus units from supporting one another effectively. Dust rose across the battlefield, obscuring visibility. Sound carried unevenly. Commands issued to the front did not reach the rear. Signals were misinterpreted or missed entirely. What had begun as a pursuit now unfolded as a series of disconnected engagements. For the soldiers within these formations, the experience was one of increasing confusion. The enemy did not behave predictably. They appeared, struck, and vanished. Arrows came from angles that were difficult to track. Pursuit led not to decisive engagement, but to further separation from allied units. Some Rus forces attempted to hold position, forming defensive lines in the hope of stabilizing the situation. Others continued to advance, driven by momentum and the belief that the enemy was still in retreat. This divergence in response deepened the fragmentation. The Cumans were among the first to reach a breaking point. Their initial contact with the Mongols had already shaken their confidence. As the battle unfolded in a pattern they recognized and feared, their cohesion began to falter. When Mongol pressure intensified on their flank, they withdrew, not in an orderly fashion, but in a rapid retreat that cut across the lines of the advancing Rus forces. This movement had immediate consequences. Units that had been engaged with the Mongols suddenly found their flanks exposed. Others, moving forward, collided with retreating allies, creating disorder in their ranks. The Mongols did not need to create chaos. They only needed to amplify it. With the Cumans withdrawing and the Rus formation stretched and misaligned, the conditions for decisive action began to emerge. Subutai and Jebe had achieved what they had set out to do. The coalition army was no longer a single force. It was a collection of isolated parts, each vulnerable, each engaged on terms it did not control. Now, the Mongols would begin to close the distance. The battlefield did not shift suddenly. It tightened. Like a net being drawn slowly inward, the space between Rus contingents narrowed not through Mongol speed alone, but through the loss of coordination among the coalition itself. What had begun as pursuit had become entanglement, then fragmentation, then isolation. By the time the full weight of the Mongol maneuver was visible, the Rus army was no longer fighting one battle. It was fighting many. At the center of the struggle, Mstislav the Bold continued to hold a position near the forward edge of the engagement. His forces had advanced too far to easily disengage, and the Mongol pressure around him had become constant. Mounted archers circled at range, their arrows falling in steady rhythm, forcing shields upward, breaking formations, wearing down both men and horses. Each attempt to push forward met the same response, withdrawal followed by renewed encirclement. The Mongols never offered a static line. They offered movement that punished movement. Behind him, the rest of the coalition struggled to reassemble what had already begun to dissolve. Mstislav of Kiev attempted to establish a fortified position near the riverbank. It was an instinctive return to structure, wagons, terrain, and defensive anchoring. But even this partial stabilization came too late. The surrounding forces were already separated by distance and Mongol pressure. Support could not arrive in time. Coordination had become intermittent, dependent on messengers who rarely reached their destination intact. The Mongols then completed the operational pattern they had been shaping since the first contact. They stopped chasing and began enclosing. Cavalry units moved outward, forming a wide perimeter that gradually contracted. Not a single decisive charge, but a layered tightening, cutting off retreat routes, isolating pockets of resistance, preventing regrouping. Each isolated group of Rus soldiers now faced local superiority, even if the total numbers on the field still favored them on paper. But paper does not fight. Discipline does, and cohesion had already failed. Within hours, resistance in multiple sectors began to collapse independently. Some units broke under pressure and attempted to flee westward, only to find Mongol detachments already positioned along expected routes. Others fought in place until overwhelmed, surrounded by mobility they could not match. The Cumans, once the first to flee their own defeat, now fully withdrew from the field. Their retreat accelerated the unraveling, removing one of the most mobile components of the coalition and exposing flanks that could not be repaired. Mstislav the bold position was eventually overrun. His forces, exhausted and surrounded, were reduced in sustained combat that lacked any avenue for recovery. The Mongols did not rush this phase. They maintained pressure, rotated fresh units, and allowed attrition to complete what maneuver had begun. Further back, Mstislav of Kiev's fortified camp held for a time, but isolation made defense meaningless in the long term. Cut off from relief, surrounded on multiple sides, the position was gradually compressed until resistance became untenable. What followed was not a single moment of defeat, but a sequence of collapses across the battlefield. Some princes escaped with fragments of their forces. Many did not. The Mongols, consistent with their broader practice, did not remain to occupy. Once resistance ceased, they withdrew as quickly as they had arrived, continuing their reconnaissance of the western steppe rather than establishing territorial control. The aftermath left the Rus principalities with a stark realization. This had not been a battle of numbers. It had been a battle of structure. The coalition had outnumbered the Mongols significantly, yet it had never functioned as a unified force. Command fragmentation, delayed coordination, and the inability to interpret Mongol mobility had transformed numerical superiority into operational disadvantage. For the Mongols, Kalka was not a conquest to be held. It was a demonstration completed, a proof of concept for warfare that did not rely on holding ground, but on controlling perception, movement, and fragmentation. In the years that followed, the Rus would remember Kalka not as an isolated defeat, but as an introduction, a first contact with a system of war that did not resemble the conflicts they had known. The steppe, once seen as distance, had become approach, and beyond it, the Mongol advance continued.